Thank you very much, Brad. Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
It's a pleasure to see so many of you here on October 22, 180 years since the Great Disappointment. So an auspicious date or an inauspicious date, depending on how you look at it, I suppose. This is, as Professor Haas said, the 6th Annual Adventist Archives Lecture at Washington Adventist University, which is co-sponsored by the Honors College and by the General Conference Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research. We in the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research value our partnership with Washington Adventist University, and it's a pleasure to see President Spence here this evening. We value our partnership with WAU, and we value particularly our partnership with the Honors College. This lectureship started in 2019, right before COVID hit, and so the second and third lectures were both online on Zoom, though ironically that meant they had the highest attendance of any of our lectures, with people coming from right across America, in fact, but of course online. And then in 2022, we were back to in-person with Doug Morgan. We've had myself, we've had Dr. Benjamin Baker, Dr. David Holland, Dr. Douglas Morgan, last year, Dr. Michael Campbell, which was our first year here in the Weiss Library, and this year, our current speaker, who I'll come to in a moment. But first, let me just say thank you to the Weiss Library for hosting us here. As I said, this is the second year. It's nice to be in such an historic setting with reminders of Adventist history. If you haven't looked at the display about Millerite periodicals and books, then please do so at the end. It's an excellent display and includes copy of the periodical The Hope of Israel, which is one of only 3 known copies that survive anywhere, as Dr. Burt was just telling me. And so to our speaker this evening, Dr. Merlin Burt. Dr. Burt is director of the Ellen G. White Estate, with its headquarters at the World Church headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. But Dr. Burt had a distinguished, indeed an illustrious career as an academic before he came to that position. He taught at Loma Linda University and then at Andrews University, where he was founding director of the Center for Adventist Research, helped to bring together the Ellen G. White Estate branch office, the rare book and manuscript holdings of the James White Library, and various other collections as well into one powerful center for Adventist research. He's very well published his PhD dissertation, which sadly has not been published, but is truly a seminal work on Adventist history. Several books and many book chapters and articles in both scholarly fora and in church periodicals. So we're in very good hands tonight with Dr. Merlin Burt, who will be talking about conditional immortality and its connection between the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventists. So please let's welcome Dr. Burt.
Thank you, Dr. Trim, for your kind words and the opportunity to be here with you in this lectureship. And I also would like to say how glad I am to meet Dr. Weymouth Spence, president here at WAU. Appreciate your supportiveness of these type of events. It helps us remember the history of God's working, and we're in good hands with the president with that type of appreciation. So thank you. And also, it was a pleasure to meet and visit a little bit with Bradford Hawes, Dr. Hawes. There he is. He took me and showed me the Heritage Room, which I hadn't seen for several decades. And it was nice to do that. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to get to know you a little better, too. And also, Kathy Hecht, thank you for a good chance to meet you as well. And now I've started mentioning people, and I know a number of the rest of you, too, but I'll stop right now. Although it is nice to see Jonathan Scriven, and I've known his father in past years, so it's good to see you here at Washington Adventist University. I wanted to, this evening, look at a topic that is really quite interesting. Yes, we need to distribute the paper. I'm treating this as an academic event because that's my understanding of what it is. So no PowerPoints. I'm not preaching. This is an opportunity to read a paper together. You're welcome to take this with you. It will be published with Dr. Trim's or the GC ASTR publication. It will come out in not too long of a time, I suppose. Next year. Okay, so in a while, but you can have a copy of this. The history of this paper is really work that I was working on to prepare a textbook on the development of Seventh-day Adventist theology. And I have not gotten to the point of finishing that book. This is not yet a chapter, so that would be too much to glorify it to that level, but it is the research in preparation for one of the chapters. And so I decided I would use it because I'm not sure with my current work if I'll be able to finish a textbook like I'm intending to. Maybe in retirement, we'll see. So I'd like to read this to you. I brought a couple of items that I'll tell you about as we're reading the paper. And I'm going to get my glasses. Excuse me for needing to do that. So I've titled this paper, and actually, if you don't mind, I would like us to have a word of prayer together before we begin. Can we do this? Loving Father, be with us. This is interesting information. It's valuable to understand, but it also has spiritual importance and value too, because it relates to your word, the Bible, and the revelation you've given us about what happens when we die, and the future, and our hope for the future. So it has very personal and direct relevance. So I pray that you would be with us, that as we learn, we would also feel the sweet touch and promptings of your Holy Spirit. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I've titled this Millerite Conditionalism, a Doctrine Adopted by Seventh-day Adventists. And I'll read it to you and maybe comment a little bit as we go along from time to time. The biblical idea of death being an end of all life, including independent separation from the body soul, has been held by Christians since the time of Jesus. Closely connected to the belief that hell and the destruction of sin and evil will be finished or ended rather than continue without end. At its core, this view, referred to as conditionalism, it's conditional immortality, that's why it's called conditionalism, teaches that immortality is a gift of God and not an intrinsic part of the sinful human nature. See 1 Timothy 6:16. The good news of the gospel is that through the resurrection at the second coming of Jesus, God will give immortality to the redeemed as a gift. And there's some texts, and there are many more than I've put here, but these are a few. D.M. Canwright, while still a Seventh-day Adventist, nicely summarized the progression of publications in New England during the first decade of the 19th century that influenced some who would become Millerite conditionalists. Elias Smith, a founder of the Christian Connection, influenced thousands of Christians through the Herald of Gospel Liberty, published sermons of the Unitarian minister Aaron Bancroft also played a role. Jay Sellen in Canandaigua, New York, which, by the way, happens to be the same town that Franklin Hahn was from, who was a close associate of Hiram Edson. He wrote a book that impacted some people in Western New York. The books of Walter Balfour in Massachusetts during the 1820s, Calvin French's 1842 book, Immortality, the Gift of God, was also important. Henry Jones was another American conditionalist, somewhat related to Millerites. He's someone that really deserves a paper all by himself. There's a whole lot of interesting things about Henry Jones. There were conditionalists in England and other parts of the Christian world that are referenced by Isaac Welcome and Leroy Froome, among others. But most important was the influence of George Storrs. and those connected to him. It is his experience and teaching that figured most prominently for Millerites and the various groups and denominations, really, it should say, that would emerge from them. I had to ask Tim Poyer to help me, and I had him bring a copy of George Storrs' sermons. It's printed later in 1856, but what's interesting, and this is the one place where it'd be good to have a picture up on the screen, but this is actually a picture of George Storrs. So if any of you want to visualize what he looked like about 1856, so this is a little over 10 years after the 1844 expectation, you're welcome to come up afterwards and take a look at the picture of the book. William Miller, as a Baptist, remained opposed to conditionalism throughout his life. Both his Baptist faith and his experience with deism made him particularly resistant to any form of, quote, annihilationism. Before his conversion, he had found the deistic idea of eternal oblivion for all humans after death to be both fearful and unsatisfying. Perhaps based on his experience, Miller viewed conditionalism as too similar to this view. Other key leaders of the Millerite movement would also reject conditionalism. Up until 1844, conditionalism would remain a minority view, but transitioned to a majority view, but continued to elude key leaders like J.V. Himes, Josiah Litch, and William Miller. The teaching of the unconscious state of the dead and the final destruction of the wicked would transition from relative obscurity before 1843 to a major issue in structuring the organization of post-1844 Adventists. It would also be the baseline view for Sabbatarian Adventists, who later became Seventh-day Adventists. This transition was largely initiated by George Storrs, who was influenced by Henry Grew. Storrs then influenced Charles Fitch, and together they made conditionalism a major point of discussion during the year 1844, which is, of course, the year of expectation for Jesus' soon return. So we want to spend a little time on the background of George Storrs, the experience of George Storrs. You can see his birth and death dates here. He's born a bit before most of the other Adventist pioneers, except for maybe Joseph Bates. George Storrs was born into a wealthy farmer family in Lebanon, New Hampshire, the youngest of 8 children. He was first a Congregationalist and then a Methodist. He remained a Methodist minister until 1840, when he withdrew because of his abolitionist views, which is an interesting study that you could look at with the Millerite movement. In 1837, George Storrs read an early work of Henry Grew and adopted the view that the lost would be annihilated in the fires of hell. Storrs described his experience in the third person. In 1837, 3 years prior to Storrs' withdrawal from the Methodist Episcopal Church, his mind was first called to the consideration of the subject of the final destiny of the wicked men as being possibly an entire extinction of being and not endless preservation in sin and suffering. This was by a small anonymous pamphlet put forth as he learned by Henry Grew of Philadelphia. He read it and passed away a leisure hour while passing from Boston to New York. Henry Grew wrote on such subjects as the Trinity, Sabbath, the unconscious state of the dead, the destruction of the wicked, and hell. A brief overview will provide some understanding of his theological emphasis. Between 1824 and 1855, Grew published 3 editions of a tract opposing the doctrine of the Trinity, and arguing that Jesus was the divine first or only begotten Son of God the Father, and thus originated and inferior. An interesting point here, we could mention the Christian Connection Church, and Elias Smith was also anti-Trinitarian. So you have kind of an environment of this, and it's curious that to this day, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are also conditionalists, are anti-Trinitarian. And of course, their connection goes back to the Advent Christian Church, not the Seventh-day Adventists, for which I guess we're being recorded, so I won't say any more than that. I'll pause in my comments. Well, I'll just say it. I'm grateful that it didn't come from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because while we agree on conditionalism, generally, we have some other areas we don't agree with. Grew also wrote at least 2 tracts on the subject of the Sabbath. In 1838 and 1850, he published The Sabbath, and in 1844, he rebutted aspects of Amos Phelps' 1841 book, An Argument for the Perpetuity of the Sabbath. Grew did not advocate for keeping the 7th day of the week, but rather supported Sunday. Because of Storrs' influence, Grew is best remembered for his belief in the non-immortality of the soul. His 1837 anonymous tract mentioned by Storrs led to 2 other important tracts, The Intermediate State in 1844 and Future Punishment, Not Eternal Life in Misery but Destruction, 1850. Grew would later connect with the Age to Come Adventists during the 1860s. It's interesting to note that many of the tracts by Grew were owned by Seventh-day Adventists. I actually have in my own library, I have a number of early Adventist materials, a collection of Seventh-day Adventist tracts that includes a couple of tracts by Henry Grew. And this was a book that had belonged to an early Adventist. So it's demonstrated even in my own library. Ministers including J.B. Frisbee and J.H. Wagner at the Center for Adventist Research, the books we have from Grew were in their possession at one point. They made various book margin notes in response to Grew's views. Thus, Grew's interaction extended directly to Sabbatarian Adventists apart from his indirect impact through George Storrs. So now let's turn to actually George Storrs' 6 sermons and Intermediate State of the Dead. Development of George Storrs' presentation of his views on the non-immortality of the soul, or natural immortality of the soul, began through a series of 3 letters written to a Methodist minister colleague beginning in December 17, 1840. These were then published in 1841 as an inquiry, Are the souls of the wicked immortal, in 3 letters. This was followed by an expansion during the spring of 1842 to 6 sermons that he presented in Albany, New York. These 6 sermons were then first published as an inquiry, Are the souls of the wicked immortal, in 6 sermons. And you can see in the footnotes more details on this. These sermons were then repeatedly reprinted in his paper, Bible Examiners. I brought with me my own personal copy of one that I believe I got from the American Antiquarian Society, to have a copy of the Bible Examiner. By the way, there's an original page, at least, of the Bible Examiner in the case back here. It's not the 6 sermons, but it is an original, so you can take a peek at that afterwards. This is the one from May of 1843, and you can see it's a fairly thick publication. He has some things on the front, letters and so forth, like a periodical, but then the bulk of this is an inquiry, Are the wicked immortal, in 6 sermons. So he would frequently reprint this so that it was kept before people through his periodical, as well as then through book and other publications that he would do over the years. It should also be noted that, well, let me say this first. In this issue, he notes that already 15,000 copies of 6 sermons have been published. He continued to revise and publish his 6 sermons during 1843 and 1844, with many thousands of copies printed and distributed in New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, throughout Ohio, and the state of Indiana. And those are in the footnote, but there are other places as well. In the 1880 memorial issue of the Bible Examiner, it was reported that, quote, nearly, if not quite, 200,000 copies of 6 sermons had been circulated. While the emphasis of both Grew and Storrs was to reject an eternally burning hell, the basis was the unconscious state of the human soul between death and the resurrection. They referred to this period, and it really comes from Grew, and Grew, I think, got it from some other people too, but refer to it as the intermediate state. Following his 6 sermons, Storrs added another article, and it's also in this particular issue that we often don't talk about, but it's just as important as the 6 sermons, and maybe even more important because it's not mentioned as a part of the mix. And that is the intermediate state of the dead, or state from death until the resurrection. Thus, his 6 sermons are directly connected to the state of the dead with what might be considered a 7th sermon or discourse, though he did not describe it in that way. So the content. For many years, I'd known the importance of George Storrs, and I'd glanced at his papers. I'd looked through them a little bit. But some years ago, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, I said, okay, I really want to sit down and study what is here. What is he really writing? So this is just a brief summary, but I want to go through each of the sermons with you and just give you a little sense of what he's presenting, because this impacted Millerites, and it then impacted the denominations or groups that would come from the Millerites, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In light of the importance of Storrs' 6 sermons, a brief overview is provided of the 1843 presentation of his views in the Bible Examiner. His presentation appealed to scripture, reason, and logic, as well as experience. Content of Storrs' 6 sermons began in the first sermon by challenging the idea of, quote, an eternal state of conscious being in misery, or an eternally burning hell for the lost. He addressed the arguments Christians have used for an immortal soul, and then presented biblical commentary. Observing that immortality is only ascribed to God, 1 Timothy 1:7, he showed that humans can lose their souls, and 2 gospel texts. He then defined death as the, quote, extinction of life, and that the, quote, wicked would, quote, utterly perish in their own corruption. He finally answered some questions, including how to understand the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, ending with the idea of an eternal or everlasting hell applying to the effect rather than the duration, which continues to be an important way of understanding scripture for Seventh-day Adventists and other conditionalists. The second sermon focused on the punishment of the wicked. The sermon text, "Ye shall not surely die," from Genesis 4:4, was the first lie of Satan in the Garden of Eden. In this discourse, he essentially contrasts many of the scriptural words for the death and the wicked, perish, destruction, burn them up, perdition, second death, etc., with the life of the redeemed, eternal life, put on immortality, etc. He ended by comparing the resurrected redeemed, over whom second death has no power, who will live in a new heaven and a new earth after the first heaven and the first earth have passed away. And of course, quoting from Revelation 20 and 21. The entire third sermon answered 2 major issues: the forever and ever torment of Revelation 14:9 through 11, and character of God and justice. In addressing the second angel's message of Revelation 14, he connected it to Revelation 18. Babylon is, quote, utterly burnt with fire, and, quote, thrown down and shall be found no more at all. He applied Revelation 14 to the judgment of Babylon and those living in the present world, and not, quote, the punishment of the wicked in the future state. He saw both Revelation 14 and 18 represented as occurring upon this earth before the restoration of the new earth, which will be the home of the saints. He concluded that because of this, there cannot be an eternally burning hell. He used the second half of his sermon to address the character of God and justice, the unreasonableness of the idea of infinite punishment for all of the lost, whether a child who has just arrived to the years of understanding and dies impenitent, or, as Storrs named, someone of great wickedness like Voltaire. This is what he said, so we're quoting him. Voltaire was wicked, I think. Storrs argued that only the, quote, utter extinction of being with varying degrees of torment prior to this event, according to the degree of the guilt of the transgressor, can be a reasonable justice. He concluded with a presumption of the hope of eternal life through Christ, the soul's physician. I like his way of describing Jesus that way, Christ, the soul's physician. In the fourth sermon, Storrs continued with the second part of the third sermon, answering the argument that endless torment must be true because the church fathers taught it. I mean, it's not the theory of that. His answer was an exposition on the teaching of the New Testament. He used 6 witnesses against unending punishment: John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter, James, John, Jude, and Paul. The Bible study was ended with a final appeal: "Oh, come to Christ and live." They were sermons after all. Storrs' fifth sermon continued answering objections. He discussed the idea of spiritual death and considered it the effect of sin, not to be confused with the destruction of being as the final punishment of sin. Also, the idea that most Christians teach an eternally burning hell, and therefore it must be true. He responded that all denominations have truth and error in their teachings. Some reject an idea because it is new, understanding to which he replied that if it is in the Bible, it is not new. He also showed that there were some very old errors. He ended with a response to Joseph Benson's sermon, "The Future Misery of the Wicked," published in 1791. This was particularly compelling. I'll read it to you, and I even got a little as I was reading it. He quoted Benson's vivid description of God presiding over hell. What does that say about God, of course? Quoting Benson, "God is present in hell in his infinite justice and almighty wrath as an unfathomable sea of liquid fire where the wicked must drink in everlasting torture. As heaven would be no heaven if God did not there manifest his love, so hell would be no hell if God did not there display his wrath. God is therefore himself present in hell to see the punishment of these rebels against his government, that it may be adequate to the infinity of their guilt. His fiery indignation kindles, and his incensed fury feeds the flame of their torment, while his powerful presence and operation maintains their being and render all their powers most acutely sensible, thus setting the keenest edge upon their pain and making it cut most intolerably deep. He will exert all his divine attributes to make them as wretched as the capacity of their nature will admit." I have put ellipses here just to make a comment. He goes on to talk about God actually sustaining the sanity of the wicked so they could suffer eternally. So we have this supernatural sustaining of capacity to inflict an infinity of pain over time. Storrs attributed these remarks to horrible doctrines based on imagination rather than scripture, and instead described the second death in the final lake of fire with these words: "Oh, that sinners make awake to see their danger and fly from the doom that awaits them. Oh, the thoughts of the anguish that a dying soul must feel, an anguish kindled by a sense of guilt, the sight of what to them is lost forever, and the curse of the violated law, which will cause their souls to perish without recovery and without hope." He saw this as more consistent with Scripture and a correct view of both the love and justice of God. The sixth and last sermon countered the idea that biblical words such as die, death, destroy, burned up, perish, etc., were to be taken literally when referring to the destiny of wicked men. Like the fourth sermon, this final sermon contained a Bible study. He strongly opposed making the term life and death mystic or figurative. His texts included, and they're listed there, he ended his series of sermons with 2 simple points. 1, humans inherit from Adam a dying nature and are destitute of immortality. And 2, for those who will choose, and even those who cannot choose, God has given his Son, Jesus Christ, to die for us, that we might not perish, but have eternal life. I think that deserves an amen, even in an academic setting. The net effect of these sermons was to present the scriptural view of death and the destruction of the lost with an effective appeal for a correct understanding of the loving and just character of God. Nearly all that Storrs presented in his 1843 6 sermons would be consistent with current Seventh-day Adventist beliefs. So the content of this seventh sermon, the intermediate state of the dead. George Storrs and Henry Grew treated the state of the dead and the resurrection as separate topics from the eternal life of the redeemed in the new earth and the destruction of the wicked in hell. Storrs' central point was that the doctrine of an intermediate state of conscious being after death and before the second coming of Christ has led to a denial of the resurrection of the body. In his article, Storrs gave careful Bible evidence for his position that the soul does not have existence apart from the body. He used many texts. He answered various objections, including Jesus' statement to the thief on the cross that today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Using texts like John 20:17 and John 5:25, he demonstrated that Jesus was not in paradise the day he died, and that the dead are waiting to hear the voice of Jesus at his second coming. Hence the locating of the English comma, right? When you read that text. Other popular ideas used to support a conscious state of the dead were answered, such as Paul being out of the body, Jesus seeing Moses and Elijah, souls under the altar, Revelation 6:9, the rich man and Lazarus, and I guess there are a few others. Storrs concluded the article with a Bible study on the resurrection. After discussing various texts, he summarized his understanding. The period, however, long between death to the resurrection is as no time, because perfect unconsciousness annihilates the time to the person asleep. And it is precisely the same to them as though they had been glorified, body and soul, at death. And with this additional happiness, that all the redeemed, not already raised, will wake up together. Blessed hour, glorious day, when death is swallowed up in victory, and the whole company of the saints shall shout the triumph at once. While often overlooked by those who review George Storrs' sermons, his material on the intermediate state is vital and must be given due consideration to adequately round out his overall teaching and influence on early Sabbatarians and Seventh-day Adventists. I want to move now from Storrs specifically to talk a little bit about what happens as a result of this teaching, as far as the denominational developments. George Storrs, writing on the intermediate state and the destruction of the wicked, produced a broad response in the Millerite movement. Some who read his writings were already conditionalists, including, as I mentioned, the Christian Connection. Elias Smith, who has been mentioned already, taught similar views to Storrs early in the 19th century. Many were converted to this view by Storrs. Most notable was Charles Fitch. Fitch had helped Storrs to accept and then begin to preach the Millerite Advent doctrine beginning in 1843. But it was not until January of 1844 that Fitch accepted conditionalism. Fitch wrote in January 25 from Cleveland, Ohio, where he lived and ministered, quote, "As you have long been fighting the Lord's battles alone on the subject of the state of the dead and the final doom of the wicked, I write this to say that I am at last, after much thought and prayer, and full conviction of duty to God, prepared to take my stand by your side." Fitch's new advocacy greatly expanded the discussion among Millerites. Josiah Litch engaged in a debate with Fitch and went so far to publish a response in an 1844 single-issue periodical, The Anti-Annihilationist. William Miller wrote a letter on May 7, 1844, declaring, "I disclaim any connection, fellowship, or sympathy with Brother Storrs' views on the intermediate state and the end of the wicked." After the fall 1844 disappointment, the conflict over the state of the dead would continue until mainline, this would be the main group, or non-Sabbatarian Millerites were split into various groups. 19th century Advent Christian historian Isaac Wellcome observed that as a result of Fitch's support, in a short time, a large number of Adventist ministry embraced the above views, this is Storrs and Fitch's views, and commenced preaching and writing them. Wellcome then named 27 people and concluded that the number has continued to increase until perhaps 7/8 of the Advent Christian body now believe them, the views of George Storrs and Charles Fitch. David Dean, historian for that denomination, observed that the ever-growing number of conditionalists believed the Advent message could not be preached properly if the Bible teaching on the destiny of the wicked were excluded. All right? So the four divisions of mainline Adventists. Various historians, both Seventh-day Adventist and Advent Christian, have helpfully described the complexity of Millerite divisions following the May 1845 Albany Conference. This fragmentation was greatly influenced by disagreement over conditionalism. During the 5 years after the 1844 expectation, the leading Adventist paper, the Advent Herald, under the firm leadership of J.B. Himes, strongly opposed conditional immortality. David Dean observed that, quote, the usual scholarly and gentlemanly periodical descended into vindictive personal attacks, bitter and sarcastic tirades. Conditionalists gradually concluded that the Herald was clearly opposed to the views held by the majority of Adventists on the immortality question. The Bible Advocate, an alternate Adventist paper, was started to allow conditionalists and others who disagreed with Himes and the Advent Herald to communicate their views. Though the Bible Advocate ceased publication toward the end of 1848 and merged into the Advent Harbinger in Rochester, New York, conditional immortality Adventists continued to meet regularly. Union, as they were called, camp meetings were held in North Wilbraham, just east of Springfield, Massachusetts, beginning in 1849 and continuing until the 1860s. After the passing of the 1854 time expectation, which was very significant for the mainline group of Adventists, not Sabbatarian Adventists, because of the help of Ellen White, we were no longer time setters, although there were some individuals involved in that. After the 1854 time expectation, Miles Grant and his World Crisis also played an important unifying role for conditionalists. The final result was organizational separation. First, the American Evangelical Adventist Conference, formally organized in 1858 and included Advent Herald Publishing Office with other formal aspects of denominational organization. This group would continue until the 1880s, when their only unique doctrinal distinctive, a personal premillennial second coming of Christ, would be widely accepted by American Protestants. Thus, there remained little reason for separate existence. The final remnants of evangelical Adventist activities would end during the 1920s. The second group became the Advent Christian Church. Miles Grant had refused to join evangelical Adventists and with other conditionalists met in 1860 and formed the Christian Association, which was soon renamed the Advent Christian Association. Though many refused at first to acknowledge that a denomination had been formed due to anti-organizational sentiment, it has endured to this day and retains its conditionalist views, which may be one reason why they still exist, because they have a few distinctives. They're also one of the very few groups who still have a historicist view of prophecy. Others have gone to other views on prophecy. The third group was the Life and Advent Union. Miles Grant, editor of the World Crisis, modified the conditionalist view of the Advent Christian group to reject that the wicked would ever be resurrected. The punishment, you see. George Storrs abandoned his previous view and theologically joined with Grant. In 1863, Storrs became the president of the newly formed or of a newly formed Life and Advent Union group, Storrs also began a new paper, the Herald of Life and the Coming Kingdom. By 1864, Union members were no longer allowed in the Advent Christian Association. But by 1920, the Advent Christians and Union Adventists were exchanging delegates at each other's general conference meetings. The diminishing numbers of the Union Adventists ultimately led to their merger with the Advent Christian Church in 1964. So we have this little theological disagreement on what happens with the wicked and death that kind of finally they come back together. Finally, a fourth group emerged, which were popularly called Age to Come Adventists. This conditionalist group shifted their expectation to a temporal earthly kingdom at the return of Christ, with the restoration of Israel as the kingdom of God and head over the Gentile nations, a very different view from the Millerite movement. Joseph Marsh, editor of the Advent Harbinger and Bible Advocate, was joined by George Storrs, Henry Grew, J.B. Cook, and O.R.L. Crozier. These are names you're familiar with, I think. All who have moved beyond the Sabbath, moved beyond Seventh-day Adventist or Sabbatarian Adventist sanctuary views, and are now a part of this organization, in a loose connection through the last decade of the 19th century. In 1921, though, remaining congregational in polity, they finally organized a headquarters in Oregon, Illinois, referred to as the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith. Today, the group calls itself the Church of God General Conference and focuses its ministry through the Atlanta Bible College in Atlanta, Georgia. I had the privilege of going and visiting that college and actually having lunch, it was a lunch with their leadership. It was the first time any of them had ever fellowshipped with a Seventh-day Adventist. And they felt like they were living in a surreal world to be eating with me. But we had a cordial interaction and discussion. They happened to have in their materials a photograph of Joseph Marsh. It's the only photograph I've found, so we do have a picture of him, and a few issues of some early periodicals in their archives that we do not have within the Seventh-day Adventist orbit or even the Advent Christian orbit. Very interesting. A small group, though, very small. It connects with non-Trinitarians who also include those who still hold the name Church of God, Abrahamic Faith, and Church of the Blessed Hope. Sabbatarians and conditionalists. Storrs' Millerite era conditionalism views directly influenced those who would later become Seventh-day Adventists. In his autobiography, James White wrote that Storrs' 6 sermons was widely circulated among Adventists. He hinted at his acceptance of Storrs' views when he observed that, quote, the doctrine of man's unconsciousness in death and the destruction of the wicked was being adopted by some and regarded with favor by many. He believed that, quote, the time had come in the providence of God for the question to be agitated. As early as 1847, James White had integrated conditionalism into what would become the Seventh-day Adventist framework of eschatology in A Word to the Little Flock. Probably familiar with this publication, our first publication combining the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In the last section on the final judgment, James White was clear on the unconscious state of the dead and the final destruction of the wicked. He wrote that at the second coming, the Son of Man will raise the sleeping saints. Referring to the lost at the second coming, he continued, the wicked are to remain silent in the dust all through the 1,000 years. He concluded with the, quote, execution of the judgment. Then God will have a clear universe for the devil and his angels, and all the wicked will be burnt up, root and branch. This tract also included content from both Ellen White and Joseph Bates. Ellen White recollected that about 1843, as a teenager in Portland, Maine, she overheard her mother speaking with another Christian friend about a sermon they had recently heard that the soul had not natural immortality. When Ellen expressed surprise and concern that people would not be converted, Eunice Harmon, her mother, responded, if the love of God will not induce the rebel to yield, the terrors of an eternal hell will not drive them to repentance. The love of Jesus attracts, it will subdue the hardest hearts. Good words from a mother to her daughter. For a few months, Ellen White thought about it and then heard a sermon on the topic herself, although she doesn't name the individuals or individual on the topic herself, that settled her thinking on the topic. There are various memory statements from Seventh-day Adventists who had been Millerites and accepted conditional immortality through the publications by Storrs and others. Two examples I'm providing for you. Here's the first. In 1843, I was handed a paper containing Brother Storrs' 6 sermons on the final destruction of the wicked. This was as much as I could stand, having always been taught the old theory that the wicked would live eternally in hell, or that they would die the second death and be destroyed, but yet live and never die. Another one, and the names are below. They're not people you would readily recognize. In 1844, I got possession of the works of Elders French, Fitch, and Storrs on the life and death question. I read and saw that man had no immortality by creation, or at least he lost all claim to it at the fall. Storrs' conditionalist foundation was combined with Seventh-day Adventist eschatology. This eschatological framework would become even more important with the rise of modern spiritualism. And we could do a whole nother paper on the issue of modern spiritualism, because that does become distinctively important for Seventh-day Adventists. Spiritualism is represented in the book of Revelation. Seventh-day Adventists as a significant part of let me say that again. Spiritualism is represented in the book of Revelation by Seventh-day Adventists as a significant part of the last deception of Satan before the second coming of Jesus. Conclusion. While there were various advocates of conditionalism during the first half of the 19th century, it was George Storrs who played the most important role in the Millerite movement. He influenced many, including those who would later become Sabbatarian Adventists and Seventh-day Adventists. When Charles Fitch embraced Storrs' Bible teaching, it raised the profile of conditionalism to prominent status. Through Fitch and Storrs' influence, the majority of post-disappointment Millerites became conditionalists. The exceptions were certain key leaders of the movement, and we've named them before: Miller, Himes, Litch, and others, and those connected with the Advent Herald in Boston. Though they would be the first to organize the American Evangelical Adventist Conference in 1858, the denomination would cease to be distinctive by the turn of the 20th century and lost all of its Adventist advocates. 3 other conditionalist mainline Adventist groups would form: the Advent Christian Church in 1860, the Church of God General Conference in 1921, have remained to this day, though with limited membership and influence. The Life and Advent Union, which had a variant view that rejected the resurrection of the wicked for a final judgment, would emerge in 1863 and continue until it finally lost adherents and reintegrated with the Advent Christian Church. George Storrs modified some aspects of his view as a conditionalist and would play an important and progressive role, first with the Advent Christians, then the Union Adventists, and finally the Church of God Age to Come Adventists. It's interesting that he moves from group to group as he progresses along here. Seventh-day Adventists followed a different course than the 4 groups connected to the majority of mainline Adventists. Mainline Adventists rejected the prophetic significance of 1844 shortly after the fall 1844 disappointment, while bridegroom Adventists, this is a technical term, continued to believe the date was important. The 2 groups would separate ways following Albany Conference and separate conferences beginning in May of 1845. Bridegroom Adventists were followed by Sabbatarian Adventists, which then became the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the early 1860s. Like many mainline post-disappointment Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists were conditionalists and have remained consistent in holding to the non-immortality of the soul view and the destruction of the wicked at the final judgment. And we could note, I think this group would know it, but we could note that the membership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church far eclipses all other groups, with 23 roughly 23 million members now. For Seventh-day Adventists, George Storrs and Charles Fitch's pre-disappointment views have essentially remained normative as a part of Seventh-day Adventist fundamental beliefs and have been integrated into their eschatological frameworks.